Okay, this morning we are looking at Ruth. It is only 4 chapters, and there is a lot to learn from this actually. Does anyone know anything about the story behind the book of Ruth?
What do you want to know?
Pardon?
What do you want to know?
Well, a general idea of what it's about.
This lady moves to a foreign country with her husband and her 2 sons. They all die.
Well, she doesn't.
But she has two daughter-in-laws. And she wants to move back from where she came from. And both the daughter-in-laws said, okay, I'll go. And then she tells them, don't go. And one of them goes back to her own people. And Ruth goes home with her.
Okay. So anyway, that's a general synopsis. What I want to do, since it is only 4 chapters, if it's permitted and if anyone doesn't mind, what I want to do is pick 3 people out. Someone read a chapter each, and then us go over what we can learn from it. Does anyone want to volunteer to read a chapter?
I'll read a chapter that has no hard words in it.
Oh, no hard words. Okay.
I'll read.
And you'll read. Okay. So Pam, if you want to take chapter 1.
Let's see if I do.
Oh.
Okay. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Oprah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband. Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, we will go back with you to your people. But Naomi said, return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to 2 sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. At this they wept aloud again. Then Oprah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women explained, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them, call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me, the Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite. Her daughter-in-law arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning.
Thank you. Sharon, you wanna go next?
Okay. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man descending from the clan of the Amalek, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So she went out, entered the field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Amalek. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseers of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi." She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters." She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work with me, and watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you, and whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about you, what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it into wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the fields until evening. Then she thrashed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Bless the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I work with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law.
One day, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you will be well provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been, a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor. But don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly and covered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered the woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, "Don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." Then she did it. When she did it, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today."
Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat there, and behold, a close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by, so he said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. My hand will work. Then he said to the closest relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, has to sell the piece of land which belongs to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it before those who are sitting here and before the elders of all people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know, for there is one but you to redeem it, and I am after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz says, "On that day you will buy the field from the hand of Naomi. You must require Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance." The closest relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself." Now I want us, before I begin further, I want us to keep in mind what verses 5 and 6 is saying in this chapter. And there's a reason why I'm saying this. The closest relative says, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourselves, for you may have right of redemption, for I cannot redeem it." Now it was the custom in former times in Israel concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of an attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," and he removed his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and to all the people, "You are witnesses today that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belongs to Elimelech, and all that belongs to Chilion and Mahlon. Moreover, I have required Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, to be my wife in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance, so that the name of the deceased may not be cut off from his brother, or from the court of his birthplace, you are witnesses today. And all the people who were in the court, and the elders, and we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and may you achieve wealth in Ephrathah and become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez and Tamar, bore to Judah through the offspring which the Lord shall give you by this young woman. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed is the Lord, who has not left you without a redeemer today, and may his name become famous in Israel. May he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age for your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Now Naomi took the child and laid him up in her lap and became his nurse. And the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, A son has been born to Naomi. So they named him Obed. He is the father of Jesse and the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram Amminadab, and to Amminadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon Salmon, and to Salmon was born Boaz, and to Boaz Obed, and to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse David. Did anyone notice what happened here at the end from 16 through 22? Notice anything peculiar? Who had the child?
They don't know. Oh, who birthed the child?
Yes, Ruth. But he's referred to as
Son of Naomi.
son of Naomi. Okay. What we're learning here, especially in chapter 4, and we would have to go back and we would read Deuteronomy chapter 5, if you want to make notation of this, Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 5 through 10. This is a Levitical, in the Levitical system, if a man had a wife, and that man died, what would happen?
The sons would take care of it.
Well, the wife would then, in order to continue the lineage, the wife would then go to the brother,
Yeah.
and then the brother would carry on that lineage through the older brother's name. Okay? We have to remember, back then, it wasn't, everybody on equal par. What I mean by that, for example, my parents had 2 brothers or 2 sons and 4 sisters, or 4 daughters. My brother and I are considered more or less equal. Well, back then it wasn't that way. You had a hierarchy in the family. In other words, the heir was considered the older son. Then if the heir passed away, then that lineage would be carried on by the younger son. And so that younger son would then take on the role of the older brother. Does that make sense? Okay, so here, under this Levitical system that we find in mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 5 through 10, the brother would take on the older brother's wife and then carry on that lineage. It was called a Levirate law, Levirate. And what that means in the original Hebrew is husband's brother. So if you want to write that down. However, in this particular story, we see 2 lineages of this Levirate law. First off, we see the kinsman who had the primary duty. Hold on. Let's go back. what did the one who was in charge of taking on the wife, well, remember I told you to circle 5 and 6 of chapter 4? Okay. Here's one of the lineages of this law. Because it said the closest relative, remember you have the oldest died, then it goes to the next. Said, I cannot redeem it for myself lest I jeopardize my own inheritance. So, what happens in this case is that if he refuses, and we can go back once again, if you go back and read Deuteronomy chapter 25, what happens is that the one in which is to take over, if they constantly refuse, then that has to go to somebody else. Does that make sense? Okay. And so in return, we see here that Boaz then gets the right to step in, if you will, and to marry her. Talking about Ruth. Because here's the second delineation from this law. Okay? Because the seed, or the one who was supposed to be in charge of carrying on the lineage is, of course, the wife of the husband that died. But what's wrong with that? What would we read about Naomi?
Ruth was a Moabite.
Well, she was a Moabite, yes. And that's one of the main stories that we're going to get to at the end. But I'm talking about Naomi herself. How did it go from Naomi to Ruth?
I don't understand what you're asking.
Naomi couldn't have any more children.
Thank you, Barry. Naomi could not have any more children. In other words, the lineage was supposed to be carried on with Naomi since her husband died. But since she could not, the lineage in this law that we find in Deuteronomy chapter 25 is that the fact that it could be carried on, therefore, by Ruth. Now, what's peculiar about that? Okay, sorry, I'm throwing out so many questions here. I'm trying to get a full picture here to show, and I guess I'm not doing the greatest of jobs here. The story from Genesis on is the carrying out of the lineage, starting with Genesis chapter 22, where it talks about Abraham's seed. And who's Abraham's seed according to Galatians 3:16? It's Christ, right? And Christ is carried out through the lineage of who? Through David. Okay? So all this is going about in return, and we see here stumbling blocks. In other words, the man dies, and then the wife of that man, who would normally be the one who would carry on that lineage, well, she can't have children. So the first thing that we notice is that it's carried on by another man who is Boaz, and by Ruth. And Ruth is not of the Israelite lineage. Does anyone see where I'm going with this? Okay. This is kind of like a foreshadowing of what happens in Acts chapter 2. What happens in Acts chapter 2? The church is established, correct? Who is it established with? Pardon? Well, it's established by Christ. But who's it?
The Jews.
To the Jews. Thank you. That's what I'm getting at. The Jews. It's established with the Jews. And then the Gentiles does not come in until Acts chapter 10, correct? Yeah. Okay. Well, Jews come from Israel. Here we see one of the foreshadows of how that through Ruth, there will be others brought in, if you will, and accepted other than the lineage of Israel. And I guess I'm not making myself clear. I apologize.
She was she was a proselyte, isn't that the word?
She would be a proselyte, yes,
Yeah.
through marrying Boaz.
She said, your God will be my God.
Right. Your God will be my God. And so she is engrafted, if you will, into the family. Reason why I'm saying a foreshadow is because, you know, the Jews, all the way up through Acts chapter 2, is considered God's chosen people. But God has always had a plan, and this is my point here through this lesson, is that God has always had a plan for everyone to be included. Anyone that accepts the will of God and follows His laws will be included. Now, of course, today that is done through being a part of the church. See, back then you have Jews and Gentiles. Today you have the world and you have the church. So you have those in Christ, Galatians 3:27, and then you have those outside of Christ. Those outside of Christ can do what? They can become inside if they follow the will of God. You see, nothing much has changed. We can still be children of God as long as we do what? Obey His will. And today we obey His will by becoming a Christian, by following the plan of salvation. That is to hear His word, Romans 10:17, to believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6, by repenting of our sins, Luke 13:3, confessing Christ before men, Romans 10:10, and then being baptized into Christ for the remission of sins, Acts 2:38, Galatians 3:27, 1 Peter 3:21. After which, according to Romans chapter 6, we are to rise to walk in the newness of life. And that's how we become a part of God's family. So what we learn here is that anyone can be accepted if they follow God's will. So, but once again, we want to look at the significance of this. It is a significance that the Gentiles were engrafted into the Israelite or the Messianic lineage, which would then be in the line of David. And we learn that in the last few verses here, from verses 16 through 22. Because it says, then Naomi took the child, and once again laid her up and becoming his nurse. And the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi, and they named him Obed, for he is the father of Jesse and the father of David. So here we have the carrying on of the Davidic lineage. And what's important to that is that David would be in the lineage to Christ. You see here from the very beginning of the Bible, from Genesis 3:15 going up to Genesis 22 verse 18, we see the necessity of preserving Christ up until His coming. And yet, we see throughout all of the Old Covenant, and even into the New Covenant, the problems that has arisen in order for Christ to die on the cross. We've seen death. We see the threat to even, well, in fact, if we jump forward to the New Testament, what problems do we have there? We have the king who finds out that, hey, wait a minute, we're hearing this name that's going to be born that's going to be king. So what does he do? All the men 2 years and younger. My point is this, is that there has been several times, or many times actually, multiple, from the very beginning that has prevented, or tried, not prevented, but tried to prevent the bringing of Christ and then his dying on the cross. Because if he had not prevailed in dying on the cross, then what would we be in today? The state of sin.
Same as the Old Testament.
Well, absolutely, and that's my point, is that we're going forward from the Old Testament, starting with Genesis, all the way forward, and we see Satan's trying to work ever since the very beginning, starting with Genesis 3:15, of trying to prevent this. At any time, and we learn in Matthew, you can write this down, Matthew 4 and Luke 4. In Matthew 4 and Luke 4, we see the temptation of Jesus. Okay? Had Satan been able to get Jesus to sin, then we would still be lost. Had Herod prevailed in having the 2-year, had Jesus killed by destroying all the 2-year males, then we would have been lost. What I'm trying to get at is, what do we learn from this? We learn that God's will always prevail. And that's the point. We think of Romans 8:28, actually I think it's verse 31 that says, if God be for us, who can be against us?
And we talked about that last week.
Yes.
We brought it up, and we go back to 28, and just what you're talking about, this overall plan of God that cannot be stopped. That's, to me, what that means in Romans 8:28. The predestination. God foreknew all these events, and yet it was his plan, and it wasn't going to be stopped.
Absolutely, and so the point is this, is we have to make the decision. It's kind of like Joshua 24:15. Choose you this day who you will serve. It is up to us whether to do the will of God or not. Because, regardless of whether we do the will of God or not, his will is going to prevail. We may not prevail, but God's will will. God's will prevail. Sorry if that sounded redundant, but anyway. So we have to make the decision. What do we want best for us? And we see here through Ruth, yes, it is a loving story, because we really didn't touch upon that. Naomi, her husband is killed or dies. Then next thing you know, she has 2 daughter-in-laws because her 2 sons die. She urges she urges both of the daughter-in-laws to go back to their families. And Ruth does what? She says, no, I want to stay with you. I want your God to be my God. And so we see here a loving story, but we also see throughout it the providence of God. And through the love between them two, how that lineage would carry on. Yes, ma'am.
I didn't really understand in Ruth chapter 4, verse 6, this closest relative, he gave it up because he said I might endanger my own estate. And he let Boaz redeem, or I guess purchase, were they purchasing the land that belonged to Naomi's husband? Is that what they were doing?
Well, if you look at verse 7, it says, "Now this was the custom in former times in Israel, concerning the redemption and the exchange of land to confirm any matter. A man removed his sandal and gave it to another, and this was the manner of attestation." And of course, that's hard for me. Attestation in Israel. So the closest relative said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," and he removed his sandal. So basically, the relative did not want to handle what he should have taken on. That's what I remember how I said earlier that in reference to Deuteronomy chapter 5, this was one of the lineages in this custom where the nearest relative would take on the older sibling. He's saying, look, I don't want to handle it.
Is that because if he just had the one son through this, that all of his stuff would go to that one son?
Well, I'm not sure as far as the reason, but
Is that a possibility? I mean, maybe he's thinking, well, what if I don't have any more children?
maybe so. I don't know. It doesn't really say here the reasoning behind it. But the point is this, is he gave it up. And Boaz took over. And this is the reason why I brought up the providence of God, because Boaz is part of the lineage that would then go toward Christ.
Because I know he says, I might endanger my own estate.
Right. I'm not fully sure what he meant by that or how it would endanger his estate. I'll be honest with you, I'm not sure.
And if he was the firstborn.
So I do know that because of the law in Deuteronomy chapter 25 that it could go to somebody else after he, refused to do it. That in return went to Boaz, and through Boaz, as we read here at the end of chapter 4, that Boaz would be in the lineage of Obed, and Obed was born Jesse, and Jesse was born David. So the lineage of Christ would be carried on throughout. You see, it's easier to understand how that, the story of Christ would be carried on, like, for example, through Exodus with the Passover and the Israelites and so forth. But we get to Ruth and it's more like a love story, and people don't fully understand, well, how does this relate to the lineage of Christ and, and the scheme of redemption? But if we look here on on how the law was carried out, the law pertaining to Deuteronomy 25, how it was carried out, then therefore it was able to then pass from Obed on down through David. Does that make sense? Okay.
Somebody's standing outside, I think it's a visitor.
Okay.
It's kind of cold out there.
It is kind of cold, and but that is class. Thank y'all so much.